Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thanks for having me and for coming out. So what I'm going to do today is tell you about a bunch of projects that I've been working on. And just to give you an idea, and I think I'll be meeting with several of you later so we could talk in more detail. And I'm very curious to hear about all of you guys' projects. So an overarching theme in my work, one could say, is a look at skill, and I'll explain a little bit. But so basically, I had the web use project at Northwestern, and the focus of the work we do is mainly the social and policy implications of IT, in particular how use of IT may relate to social inequality. So whether it's going to help alleviate social inequality or whether it's going to increase social inequality, actually. So I suspect many of you have heard of the term digital divide. While we do some work on that, that's actually not the focus of the work that we do. Instead, one way to think about it is the second level digital divide, and the idea behind this is that even once people get connected, lots of differences will remain among them in terms of how they actually use IT. So that's what we focus on. We focus especially on actual users and the differences among them. So just to give you an idea of the overall framework of the work, so we're interested in people's socioeconomic status, and a lot of work on digital divide and digital inequality has looked at this, but we also are interested in additional factors that don't always get as much attention in the work, such as things like autonomy of use, which one could define as the freedom to use a technology when, where, and how one wants to. So that's also a factor that we look at. And also think about people's experiences with digital media and social support that they get in using media. And so what's been of interest to me in particular is how all these factors then relate to people's skills in using the internet. And then as a next step, what's of interest is how skill differences and all these other factors might then influence how people use IT. And then finally, the million-dollar question that we don't really have an answer to yet, but long-term goal is to figure out, is how all this then feeds back into people's status. So whether it's socioeconomic status or just general health and well-being. So that's what it really, especially from a sociological point of view, becomes an interesting question as well. Does all this matter in where people stand in society? Okay, so how might all this matter? I'm not going to talk about this for too long, and I suspect you have ideas yourself, but basically there are some processes through which people's position in society could be improved or not, thanks to use of digital media. And here are some words that may be sort of sociological jargon, but hopefully you're familiar with, at least with some of them. But basically the idea is that through use of IT, one can obviously improve one's skills with respect to just the IT themselves, but also have actual financial gains, or in terms of social capital, expand one's networks, derive benefits from that, and also in terms of this idea of cultural capital, just familiarizing oneself with more of what's out there in the world, being able to communicate with more types of people. So those are some potential pathways in which IT uses may be beneficial. Okay, so just to recap, the overall questions that guide my work are, so what explains skill difference? Are there skill differences among users? If yes, what explains these differences? Then how do the skill differences influence what people do online? And then overall, might all that influence people's life chances and well-being? Okay, so before I continue, it might be useful to pause for a little bit to see what I actually mean by internet skill. And to be fair, a lot of what I've been doing so far has been a narrower definition than the list of items you'll see here, but I thought I'd present this because this is where my thinking is going, and some of the future projects will encompass more of this. But so basically, some of the things that I think constitute internet skill, and I'd be curious to hear additional thoughts people have on this. So knowledge of netiquette, appropriate ways of communicating, especially with respect to email. Then knowledge of how to contribute to what's available online, usage of online tools, or even being aware of various online tools. Then being aware of what is even available online, to bother to go online to seek answers to certain questions. And then being able to find the different types of content. And then related to all this is being efficient in finding different types of content. Then there's the question of being able to evaluate the information one sees. And then finally, questions of privacy and security. So these are all a set of things that I consider internet skill. Again, this whole long set hasn't been part of the research so far, but increasingly I'm trying to expand the research to include more and more of these items. Okay, so as I said, I'll go through a few projects that I've worked on and some of the major findings from them. And I'll actually wrap up by talking a little bit about a forthcoming project. So the first big project in all this was one that focused in especially on information seeking skills. And here what I did was I was working with 100 randomly sampled adults in a New Jersey county. And so the focus of my work has always been on trying to get average users. So my studies are not on graduate students in a program, or I really try to get the average experience. And so here we had a group of people, adults 18 to 81, and did this study a few years ago. What I did was I brought them into a research center. I sat them down on a machine and asked them to look for various types of things on the web. And I also collected all sorts of survey information from them for baseline measures of their internet experiences and also demographic background. What I did this past spring was actually go back to New Jersey and re-interview as many of these people as I could find. People move a lot, so I couldn't find a lot of them, but I did get 44 of them to come back and re-interviewed and re-observed them. Those data I haven't analyzed yet. They're in the midst of being coded. But it was interesting to see that a lot of things haven't necessarily changed that much, which is interesting because by definition, everyone in this sample has been a user for at least 5 years by now, right? Because in 01, 02, I was only interested in users, so they were already users then. So one outcome, an important outcome of this project was that one had actual measures of skill, so looking at people measured here as being efficient in finding information online, and then also from that was able to derive survey instruments that could then be applied to a larger, more representative group of subjects later in other studies. So some of the findings, so people definitely differed in their skill and their abilities in finding things and their efficiency in doing so. Here are some actual examples of search terms that users typed in when I requested them to look for various types of information. And so this particular form, and this isn't all the same user, by the way, so I'm not saying this is a common mistake people make, but it was more than one person out of 100 who did this, that they searched for things without spaces. And when asked why they might be doing that, the response was, well, on the web, there are no spaces. And so, and part of the problem, of course, is that there are enough websites out there with mistakes that they still get a few results. So it's not completely obvious what they might be doing wrong, but obviously websites that have such mistakes probably aren't the best source of information.
And so they queries that you specified, or are they user-generated?
No, so I gave them tasks to perform. So look for example, the question for the lactose intolerance was, where would you get information about what that means?
So you generated queries?
The question, yeah. They generated the specific queries that they then used, right? So the question I generated. But like the plumber's local 9 was a more general one. It was simply about, let's say you were looking for a new job or exploring career opportunities, and it was up to the person to figure out what type, and they were interested in the local union, so they were looking for that. Another sort of opposite problem is that they would use spaces in URLs, but then still add the .com, .xyz at the end, which then does lead to errors. And these examples are from the 2001-2002 study. I think my favorite is the mywalletHasBeenStolen.com, which doesn't really lead to anything helpful. So one might think, okay, this was an 01, 02, things change. Well, as I said, I re-interviewed some of these people this spring. So here are a couple of things that they typed in this spring, again, having been users for over 5 years. So we have the house space of space representatives.gov, which this AOL users typed in, which didn't really lead to much, although there is actually the link to the United States House of Representatives down below, which the user didn't see, so then got confused and kept on going. Another example was this, which has all sorts of intriguing elements because NIH is not a .edu, and then there's the space. Anyway, it led to an error. Didn't really take her anywhere. So these are just examples, again, of long-term users, which I keep emphasizing because one of the arguments tends to be, oh, well, you know, once they've been online for a few years, they'll figure it out. And no, it's not necessarily the case. Okay, so some overall findings. There was a political task. The question was, find a third-party website that compares different presidential candidates' views on abortion. And so this was after the Bush-Gore, this is back then. And 43% of the people couldn't do this, given unlimited amounts of time. And I did some, and there are, in fact, lots of places on the web where you can find such a website, this being one example. I mean, this was probably the most obvious website one could go to. So I actually did a detailed analysis of what was going on, and so multiple regression, where the outcome was that someone did solve this task. And it turns out, if you put in all sorts of variables, control for all sorts of characteristics of the person, pretty much none of that matters. It doesn't matter which search engine they used either. What mattered was, did the person, not shockingly, did the person use a refined query? Meaning, did the query, and the way I coded that was, did the query include information both about abortion and the political aspect of the question, right? So did they say abortion, presidential candidates, abortion, Bush-Gore, that led to a response? Whereas if they just typed in abortion, not shockingly, that didn't spit out this response right away. So that was what made a difference in the end for this particular task. Okay, otherwise, overall, what I found was younger users were better skilled, people who had higher education are better at finding things, and then also experience and autonomy mattered. But experience, not in terms of, so I operationalized that in two ways. One was number of years people have been online, and the other was how much time people spend online, right? So frequency of use. Number of years didn't matter, and again, some of the examples I've mentioned show that too. What mattered is frequent users are better, not shockingly. And then autonomy of use as having home access and the freedom to use the medium at work.
And so what about the social dimension, whether or not they use the internet with another person?
I don't have data on that. It's a good question.
I would imagine that there are tendency you get savvier.
Right. Well, although I did have some data that's related to that, which was interesting. I hypothesized in the beginning that adults who have kids in the household will be better because of this idea that they might learn from their children. In fact, if that variable had any effect, it was usually negative. And from the qualitative interview data, I figured out that what's probably going on there is that parents actually sort of outsource their questions to their kids. The kids do the tasks for them. They never actually learn from the kids what they did. So there's that interesting twist in the support question. Okay, so I had some funding left over from that project, and so I decided to do a follow-up survey on a nationally representative group of young adults. And so here, this was, again, 18 to 26-year-olds. So focusing in on a younger group, partly because that's where, well, one of the findings from the previous study was that age matters. So I was interested, okay, well, if we only look at young users, are we still going to find differences? This was a survey, so I don't have the observational measures, but I have the survey measures of skill that I derived from some of the actual measures of skill in the previous study. So this data set is unique because it has these digital literacy measures and detailed information about types of uses. And just to give you an idea, so basically, and I have a paper that describes this in detail, but this is a measure that, okay, traditionally when measuring skills, people will ask on surveys, what is your self-perceived, what do you think is your skill level? And in this paper, I actually in detail go through analyses that show that measure is much less, is a much weaker predictor of actual skill than this type of a question. So these are the types of questions I use in my work as proxies of skill. And so I won't bore you with the regression details, although I have those slides if anyone's really interested in the actual specific coefficients. But basically what I found was, so education is related to people's skill. However, that's only if you have the basic measures, sort of the usual suspects, SES, in the model. But once you add information about use at home and experience, then those actually matter more, and education loses its relationship to skill. So if you're a home user, then you have better skill, and if you're a rare user, you have lower skill, which again makes sense. But what's also interesting is that then, as an outcome, taking diverse types of uses, so how many things do you do online, types of uses being, do you look for jobs, do you look for financial information, do you look for political information, et cetera. So creating an index of types of uses, those who are better skilled do more things online. So the idea there, and also those who are better educated do more things online. And then the idea here is that there's the potential for social inequality being perpetuated because those who are already in more advantageous positions might be using the internet for more things from which they may benefit. So that's the takeaway message here from this particular study. Okay, so continuing to be interested in, well, what happens when people are, when we control for access and we know that everyone's a user, I decided to do a study on college students in particular. And this part is a pilot, and then at the end will be the bigger study that I'll tell you about what I'll be doing starting this winter. Okay, but I teach at Northwestern, and Northwestern is an elite private school. So given that I'm interested in the average user, as I've said several times, it's not quite the right location to do this type of a study. So what I did was I'm working together with people at the first-year writing program at the University of Illinois Chicago, which is a very diverse campus. And so that's where I'm trying to answer these questions similar to ones I've listed before, but now focusing in on just students. And again, the idea is that you control for basic access, and these people are 100% wired, so let's see what people do when they're 100% wired. Okay, so I conducted a survey last winter, spring, at the University of Illinois Chicago. What's interesting here is, so this first-year writing program is the only required course on campus, which means that you have a representative sample of UIC students. And because the survey is being administered in class, it's a very high response rate. So it really is representative of the students in that population. And it's a paper pencil survey because I'm interested in skills and frequency of use and all those issues. I think it would bias the results if I sent them an online survey. Of course, this means hand coding in 1,300 plus surveys, but so it is. And again, this is a very, very detailed survey about internet uses and skill questions. Okay, so a little bit of information about this population. The mere fact that they're in college already places them a little bit above the average American. That said, again, it's a very diverse group. A lot of them are from Chicago. It's a fairly local. So UIC is not the flagship campus of the Illinois system. So a very diverse group of students. In fact, U.S. News and World Report ranked it as top 10 in ethnic diversity. So really lots of minorities in the sample. It makes for interesting comparisons. Also in terms of diversity regarding people's backgrounds, parental education, and language use. It's a very interesting group to study. Okay, so yes, it is the wired generation. They've been online for many years. They use the internet several times a day for the most part. However, interestingly, this whole voice over IP hasn't really caught up with them that much yet. It's a pretty small percentage, and I don't think I have it broken down here, but not surprisingly, those who are immigrant status are much more likely to use that. So that's interesting to show. Well, actually, yeah, there it is. So those who are not born in the U.S. are more likely users of voice over IP. Also, with respect to cell phones, if anything, I was surprised that there are 3.5% who don't have a cell phone. But I mentioned this partly because as we study internet use and IT uses, it suggests that increasingly we need to move that beyond just the computer, right? And need to be looking at the various media that users turn to. So what is it that they do online? I think it would be really interesting. I don't have the figures to have comparative figures for, say, Europe or Asia, because I suspect some of these figures are actually pretty low. I also think it's interesting the difference between how many take photos versus send photos. So there's just this taking photos for this, I guess, the sake of having the photos on your phone, not much else.
Is it about n equals 1,000 or so?
1,300.
1,300.
Okay, I think we've just been through. Oh, yeah, so access locations. So on average, there are 4 locations where they can access the internet, but there are 2 where they regularly use the internet. And for the majority of them have it at home. Although I thought it was interesting to note that still for this group, having access on campus is very important. And just that people do access the internet at a friend's place or family member's house. So there's that social component also. So there have been some articles about how students aren't using email anymore. I was actually quoted in one such article recently, and when I talked to the reporter, I said I didn't really have the evidence to suggest that they don't use email. It might be that they're ignoring emails from college administrators because those emails are boring, but that's a different issue. So what I found here was they use about 2 email accounts regularly, and the majority use their UIC email. Otherwise, this is what we have for the types of services they use. I was curious about that. For those who don't use UIC at all, it's a little bit different breakdown. And then 7% actually only use their university email account, which I thought was actually quite interesting to think that nowadays not everyone would have one of these free email accounts. Just a few additional figures that I think are just interesting. So it is really.
The reasons, sorry to interrupt, but did you get the reasons that we had second accounts? Is there anything about the UIC, like is there a limit as to how much?
No, I didn't ask about that. But I mean, I would think it's often they had accounts before they even got to college and they kept those. That's what I suspect. So they do a lot of multitasking. Just thought it's interesting to show. I think these figures are very different when you look at older generations. Okay, so I was partly interested in how much are people taking part in these more interactive features and participatory features. And blogs are supposed to be well, there's a lot of talk about blogs, obviously. But I think there's a lot of confusion that happens sometimes in these discussions because a lot of the coverage is about political blogs, but in fact, for this group, that's the least likely type of blog that they will read, right? So for this group, it's more the personal journals and discussions with friends that is likely. Then I was interested in content creation as well and broke it down by gender because there are some differences. So this question, well, blogs are online, obviously. Most of the others are not just online. This is just, do you create things? And I was just curious whether this generation, to what extent they're creating things. It was interesting to note some of the gender differences here, or the lack thereof, for example, in websites. Okay, so what is it that students actually do online? And the question here just asked them, are these things that you do? And then there were options of several times a day, daily, weekly, monthly, less often. And so what I have here is an aggregation of the daily or weekly activities on these types of websites. And I think I took out that slide, but what's interesting to note is that for the most part, almost none of this relates to people's grades, for example. So there's a little bit, so people who there is a negative relationship between, I think, downloading videos and music and people's grades. And there is a positive relationship. I think it was with maybe news, but some of them don't. They're just a few. I mean, the majority have absolutely no relationship to people's academic achievements. I think for some of these, I have to work on how I ask about them. So, for example, this visiting dating matchmaking site is an extremely low number at 4%. I think what's going on there is that they don't think of the sites where they do those sorts of things as matchmaking sites, right? So, for example, Facebook, clearly a lot of students do use that with these types of purposes, but they don't call it a matchmaking site, so they wouldn't say that here. So I need to tweak the survey a little bit to account for some types of activities more.
Where did the categories come from?
Categories, just the items?
Yeah, what you see here, getting info for schoolwork. Is that a category that you listed on the survey?
It was specifically stated as such. It's not really. So the survey specifically said, well, there were actually, this is an aggregate of 2 questions. One was this very long, it was just a list of different websites, and then the getting information for schoolwork, the library, checking fact. That was just one separate question with those 4. But it was just, how often do you do these things? And it was a list of items with this almost exact wording for the most part. Okay, so then I was also interested in some specific websites just to see how much they know about them. And the question was, have you ever visited these websites, right? So this is not how often. I just wanted to know, have they ever gone to these websites? Partly to look at sort of more mainstream media, traditional media, and then some of the more, the newer blog types of content, for example. And, okay, so focusing on Chicago content because the school is in Chicago. But it's interesting to note that with this group, again, 1,300 students, some of these, what in the political blogging community would be considered as the absolute top important sites are not that well known, but even blog search sites are not that well known. So the idea behind all this is just to show that a lot of this hype about Web 2 and all this participatory media uses is not necessarily generalizable to everyone. And I was just curious for an average group of this sort what their prevalence was. Yes, Daniel?
So what did you find as the top sites? And I'll throw in the comment that none of those are, of course, Web 2-ish kind of sites.
No, these aren't. I'll have another slide.
Okay.
No, those on the left are sort of the top sites. I mean, I don't have all the sites here that I listed, and it was sort of arbitrary, and I got the sites partly, I thought them up, and then I actually contacted some younger friends of mine to see what's hot with the, and some of the ones that I would not have thought of myself to include College Humor, because I don't know about it that much, but through these discussions with people on what I should include, I did include. So, and some of these are the more popular sites as well. Oops, sorry. And as are some music-related sites, perhaps not shockingly. Okay, I thought I'd throw this in just here, in case you guys were curious. So I have a whole bunch of questions about various services. I also have comparison of, say, MapQuest versus Yahoo Maps versus Google Maps. I don't have those figures right now, but I did some of this as well, because, again, I was curious as to how much some of these new services were taking off. Okay, so here are the Web 2 sites, Daniel. So anyone want to take a guess? So this is last winter for some of these sites. What percentage of these students might have been users? And use here meant use it often or sometimes. That's the figures I'll show.
Oh, I'd say 100% for Google.
It's a Google Scholar.
Less than
Okay, yeah,
1%.
MySpace over,
Okay, wait,
MySpace
that
over
was
50%, Facebook over 50%, everything else below 30%.
Facebook, for this demographic, college students, Facebook far higher than
Yeah.
MySpace.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I say
mutually exclusive
Wikipedia,
sets.
Wikipedia for what? How much?
over 50.
Okay.
So that's what they're doing on their own
80%.
work.
I'll take odds and ends for 200. I give YouTube a whopping like 22% penetration, but maybe even less. And I'd say that's at the high end. But Facebook and MySpace both
Oh,
like
I
40 or
think it's
50%.
I think LiveJournal and Blogger would be split.
Split in terms of.
Probably similar usage patterns.
Okay.
Let's
Okay. Ready?
Yeah.
So these are coming up in decreasing order. So very quickly we'll plunge down to less than 15. And I guess it's not decreasing. I don't know when Wikipedia came up. Anyway, so we're very quickly
Wow.
down into pretty much nothing. So, so this is partly a reality check for the excitement over some of these services. I'll be redoing this survey this winter, and I'll be very curious to see, for example, YouTube, whether that will have jumped a lot. I suspect some others will not have jumped at all.
What is Google Scholar?
What, I'm sorry? What is it?
It's citation search for research.
Oh.
Sort of like
The new
Sightseer.
SSCI?
It is
Okay,
Sightseer, actually,
I
I
do
think.
Sightseer, but not Google Scholar.
Isn't Scholar.Google essentially Sightseer?
It's
No.
similar
it's-
layout, but different database.
Scholar.Google spends a lot of time searching the net and trying to reconstruct databases itself.
Yeah, try to do both.
I thought
So
they
I guess
actually
it's
migrated
the
code from
web-based
Sightseer.
tool.
I know.
Did you have another question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you if next round around you wouldn't mind throwing in farc.com.
I'm happy to take suggestions. I don't think I had that on this time. There are definitely others that I had that I don't have on the slides here. So if you're curious, let me know. I can see if I had it. I don't think I had FARC, but I'll check that.
I just hear about that constantly, and
Oh, really?
the younger generation keeps sending me links to stuff
Oh, okay.
that they found on FARC. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear about those because obviously for a survey of this type to be useful, if you get absolutely no variance. I mean, if no one has ever heard of or used a service, it's not very interesting to have on there. Except in the case of something like Delicious, which actually gets a lot of press and excitement, and then you find out no one uses it. That's interesting, too.
Did you,
Oops.
I just wanted, did you consult with Google before they spent $1.6 billion on YouTube?
Well, I'm sure they would tell me that now this is a much higher figure, which is partly why I'm really curious to see what happens when I redo this survey in the winter.
When was this? When did you run this survey
This was in February, March.
of this year?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think the
Yeah,
figures
and
will be
YouTube
that
didn't really
different.
hit.
I'm sorry?
YouTube really didn't hit big. That was on the ramp.
Well, it's an empirical question to see how much it will have changed. Of course, then it gets complicated because they've gotten so much press just because of this buyout that who knows if people started using it because of that. So it'll.
And then another question is how often it ties into the other services. Like I know Delicious and Dig users are probably going to be much more users of YouTube at that time because that's where a lot of links end up going towards. So I'd be interested in kind of seeing combined statistics.
Oh yeah, which I can do with the data. I just haven't gotten to that point, but absolutely I can. Again, when it's so low, the numbers are so low, there's not, when it's less than 1%, there's not much you can do in terms of breaking it out further, but I can definitely do that with the data. Okay, so as I said, I mean, skill is one of my main focus in my research. So throughout the survey, there are these different types of questions that measure skill, and they measure skill in different ways. I have that skill measure that I mentioned earlier. I have that as well. But here are some other questions. Now, just to give you some idea of how these are being asked. So, for example, the aggregator feed reader question or answer that I have here, the way I collected those data was as follows. The question actually asked, do you use an aggregator or feed reader? And then it said yes, no, or don't know what it is. So that was actually pretty proactive on someone's behalf to then say, not simply say, oh, no, I don't, and sort of, oh, I actually have no idea what it is, but that to actually check off that they don't know what it is. So 41% very clearly admit to having no idea what it is, which I thought is, again, interesting given all the, every site has an RSS button now and all that. So again, I think a reality check. And again, this is a young generation. It's not the those who are barely online. This is the 100% wired generation who a lot of people tend to think of as very savvy users. So a fifth of the sample knows all of the above. So 80%, almost 80% don't know at least some of this. So then I was interested in how all this relates to a user's background, right? So what I talked about, how does who the person is relate to what they know about what they do. So the following, these are again preliminary, but the following are statistically significant differences at the bivariate statistic level. as to who has a lower level of know-how. So when it comes to an aggregate of the measures that were presented on the previous slide. So women tend to know less, African Americans tend to know less, people of Hispanic origin tend to know less, those with parents who have lower education tend to know less, etc. So again, we see some perpetuation of inequalities potentially. And then how does all this relate to what people actually do online? So again, an aggregate of different types of online activities. These are the types of groups that tend to do less. And again, we have the relationship with skill that if you know less, you're also going to use the internet for fewer things. Okay, so I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about this future study, which I'll be able to do thanks to a generous grant from the MacArthur Foundation. So it's a 2-year project starting out with, it's basically a follow-up to this survey that I've been talking about, but with much more. So I'm going to do another survey in the winter with the current first-year class at UIC, but then I'm also going to do observations of students' internet uses and training intervention, and if I am able to secure funding in the next couple of months, maybe some diary data, which I think would be exciting. But to give you a little bit of idea of what's actually going on here, so first I'll do the survey collection, collect information about uses, skills, all that I've been talking about, partly through surveys, but partly through observations, which I described in the very first study that I talked about. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to randomly assign half of the people into a training intervention. So with half of them, I won't do anything. They'll go on living their lives. Half of them I'll put through training. I'll actually split that training into online-only training and online and offline training. So in those few months, my group will put them through some training in terms of internet skills related to the items I mentioned earlier. And then at a second point in time, we will reobserve both groups to see if the training made a difference. So that's where I'm headed, and would love to hear thoughts on, I didn't say too much about this project, but it's all related to the previous project, so would love to get feedback on that. If people have ideas, or like Daniel had thoughts on what I should include on this survey, I'm always very open to considering changes, additions. And that's the project website, and that's what I have for you today.
Are you working with the library staff on this? Because a lot of what you described is basic information literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And, academic librarians are always doing this type of thing, so.
Yeah, Northwestern doesn't have a library school, but I do talk to people at the library.
Yeah, just the academic librarians, because they do all of this as part of their literacy.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, now, given what you know now about the degree to which they're all online and stuff, would you still do the survey on paper and pencil?
Yeah, absolutely. Because some of them, a lot of them, as I showed on one of the slides, do use it often, but there is a large enough number that don't have home access, that aren't frequent users, whom I would lose, and those are especially vulnerable, I think, in terms of being the ones who don't use it that often, etc. So I think it is important. Also, given that I have such a captive audience in class, it does actually make sense. It would be much harder to get them all to a class with computers. Logistically, it would actually not be helpful per se. I could use Scantron or something to make it easier to code, which I'm exploring. So
more GAs.
Yes.
So any thoughts about using proxy filters maybe at the university level to at least assess the range of variation of websites they're actually touching from a more quantitative and observational perspective rather than a self-report point?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. So there are a few things that are tricky, especially with this population. So are you basically asking, go talk to the IT folks, get their logs or something, or
I see
more directly,
many
actually
limitations to that data.
Right.
So for example, none of their library, or at least offsite library or home use would necessarily show up unless the university is also the ISP, in which case it might.
Which
but,
doesn't.
So I accept the fact that you're going to get a very skewed and partial view, but it may be a place to go. And alternatively, I guess there's the possibility of using some kind of toolbar plugin where you give them software to take home that would also capture.
Okay, so you should be able to answer why that's not an option in this study after hearing my talk about skill differences.
Right. I mean, getting them to install a toolbar may be very difficult.
So that there's another issue too, which again this should help a little bit, but actually this and the demographics data that I showed you earlier. So okay, so the proxy issue, it's difficult because while they use library and computer resources, actually a lot of them don't necessarily. So you're missing a lot of the folks there. In terms of home use, let me go back to the demographic data for this group. Very difficult to know whose use you'd be capturing on those computers. I don't have data. I have ownership data of laptops and computers. It's not clear whether the way I asked it, if it's them or if they share it. I could in the future ask, do you share your computer with anyone else? But given these figures, again, you don't know whose actual activity you're capturing. And then because of what I said about skills, I would be very hesitant to ask people to install anything. Because, yeah, I don't think that would really be viable either. So there are all those issues that I think would make it very complicated. I don't have any reason to believe that they're being dishonest, which doesn't mean, of course, that they're reliable. I mean, it's obviously a lot of survey measures have reliability problems.
Well, for example, that gambling was very low self-report. I think you listed it as about 5%. And that struck me as potentially artificially low. A lot of what I'm reading about gambling suggests, but then again, it may be accurate, but gambling seems to be the kind of thing that you might not be as willing to self-report, but seems to be an awfully big part of, I think it was up a bit, there you go. Gambling was 5%.
Well, keep in mind too that the big, Texas Hold'em push kind of happened a bit after this survey. So.
I don't know. I mean, again, it's partly just imagining the situation. There's absolutely no identifying. I mean, okay, there's identifying information on the survey in the sense that at the end, I asked them about, gender and class, and their class year and some things. But first of all, that's at the very end, and they don't even know they're getting there when they're filling out these questions. And even though, it's pretty much impossible to know. There's just nothing on the survey to tie me to who these people are. And I think they're pretty aware of that. So I don't know. It's not clear why they would wait.
No, all of these look reasonable. I'm just thinking that that's one of the issues of going with self-report data, and that it might be interesting to provide as a counterpoint some of this log data just to get a sense of it.
Absolutely. No, I can definitely see where it could be valuable. I think given the parameters, especially of this campus and this population, I think it would be extremely tricky to know who it's about. Is that something people do when they're older? These are mostly first years. And again, just to remind you, this is daily or weekly visits, so I don't have the figures here for monthly. Maybe that's the kind of thing people try out, then they don't do anymore. Probably not, but right.
Yeah, the numbers might look different if it was ever.
Which I could get. I have in the data. That's not how I parsed it for this slide.
Other question. So, what have you seen that has caught your eye as having changed dramatically over the last several years? So some of this started in 02, 03. We're living in.
You mean some of my work?
Your work in this area. So I guess I'm asking you to think about what might have changed most dramatically, if anything, over the last 3 years.
Yeah, over the years, my focus has shifted in terms of the population I'm studying, so that's a little tricky to compare. I think I can answer that best for the population that I re-interviewed this spring, right? Even though it's a small sample, it is random and it's very representative. pretty diverse. To me, what was shocking was that even, again, being users for at least 5 years, how unskilled some people continued to be. And how much people who have been online for 5 years or more, for the most case, are just not incorporating the internet into their lives that much necessarily, and that they have very set things they do online, and that's about it. And probably because of that, they don't end up getting much more skilled. I think some of this relates to one of the skill components which I mentioned, that was being aware of what's even available online. So people simply are not aware of what you can do online. Do you have a follow-up to that?
Well, yeah, so it seems like the good get better and the worst
Stay where they are.
Do the worst want to get better? I mean, is there the motivation, or are they just like, I know the internet's out there, and I know I could get more stuff, but I don't have time for it.
Right. So my response to that is, it's okay if they don't, to the extent that life today doesn't require it. But the fact is that life increasingly requires it, not just at the entertainment, recreational level, but even, for example, at the level of getting access to Medicare information, right? So there was this big push last spring, or last year, all of last year, about how, this new Medicare Plan D program, and people needed to figure it out, extremely complex, and so the government comes out saying, we've put the tools online and they can go and check it out. So one of the questions that I asked the people in the spring study was, this elderly relative of yours is seeking help with the Medicare Plan D program, try to figure out what she needs to do. And I mean, it's just very informative to see what people are doing to answer that question. And again, it's not really optional anymore, right? It's not really your choice not to be savvy, because even when people say, so some of the people who were sitting there said, I would have to give up and give them a call. Well, that's nice, except when you give them a call, you're going to get a recording. So give them a call is not exactly the silver bullet solution here, where suddenly someone will solve all your problems there. Then you'll be on the phone for 2 hours, going through the automated recordings.
I know the need is there, but you need both. You need the desire in people to be.
Well, it's not clear if it's the desire. I mean, I haven't really studied desire, so I can't say at what level it's not there, but I think it's probably fair to say that some of the systems are just too complicated for them to even, that if the desire is lacking, it may just be that they're just not connecting with the interface and what's being offered to them to get the desire. So,
or maybe they just aren't as technophilic as others. I don't know. I've just been amazed with my 13-year-old. He's web savvy and he's gaming savvy and all that. We've talked about upgrading technology, like Xbox 360 or a new version of that game or whatever, and he's like, this is fine. That's what I need. And he's just not technophilic, which, given his parents, is pretty creepy. So I don't know. And maybe what I'm suggesting is just adding a question or two to gauge that desire at the level of technophilia in other actions. Because if it's not parallel with some kind of self-actualization, it ain't gonna happen.
But I hear there's a distinction I'd like to pull out of here, and that is that I think what Esther is saying is that there's a difference between early adoption of sort of lifestyle products and the way that, in many ways, the culture has now mandated a certain skill level in technologies, or is assuming a certain set of them that is separate from, well, what do you mean you don't podcast? You're not part of the hip and cool group. But when, let's say, the Center for Disease Control sends out its warnings about, spinach, and it's only on podcasts, then you're kind of shifting the bar. But I do like the idea that you ask questions about early adoption behaviors.
Well, and this idea of desire is interesting too. I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure how to translate that into a survey question.
Oh, I can, yeah. Things like, how old is your cell phone? How much do you want a new one? How old is your desktop computer? And do you have an anticipated purchase that you would go to the store right now if only you had the money? For certain people, it's, I need a graphics card. I need a graphics card right now. And then there are the rest of us who say, I haven't really got a formulated desire in the queue waiting for execution. I mean, I do, but I'm and my wish list is on Amazon, and anybody can get me anything I got.
Okay. Karen, you had a question?
I was just thinking, the first part, I really enjoyed the story that you're telling here, tracking the different populations and tracing your research questions here. The first population where you're doing the fall, which is really neat, because when I did my PhD, I studied the elderly, which is not good for longitudinal work. Stay away from the elderly. But anyway, the finding that we haven't changed much, it's interesting if you take this offline. Because we consider a principle of information behavior is that people follow habitual patterns of seeking information. Mm-hmm. It's the same idea that you always take the same long route to work, even though it's a more efficient route. Mm-hmm. But even though you might know about it, it's not the one that you were introduced to first. This is the one that you're comfortable with. So that might have a parallel explanation here of what you're finding online.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think once I have the data coded, it'll be really interesting to go back for those cases and compare what they did 5 years ago and how much that parallels. And
you find the same thing with undergrads and libraries. It's just incredible. The first tool that they're introduced to is a dictionary. My golly, they'll keep going to a dictionary every time they have an information need. And it's the same thing about go online. They go to dictionary.com. That's kind of where they'll start. From there, they'll try and find other places if they're not good at searching.
So to connect these 2 points, it would be interesting in your next phase to really explore what piece have they picked up that was new, whether they use it properly or not. When did a need or a want collide so that they were forced to pick up some new tool? And it may be the phone bill got so high they had to go get FOIA. Or they bumped into Schedule D and they had to figure it out and there was no other way. But it would be interesting to think about the kind of stressors, because I think it is, what we're hearing is some of us have this philia that draws us to it. The rest of us have to be driven towards it with sharpened sticks. So what are the stressors that drive people to adoption of a new technology? And that way we can turn up the heat on them and make them consider those things. So.
And I think in this next project, we'll be able to do that because, again, it's not quite the thing you do on a survey, but because we're doing the observations which automatically have interview component, we can talk to them then about their uses, and then when 6 months later we re-observe everyone, we can definitely get into some of this, of is there something new in the repertoire and why might that have happened. And again, the diary data, by the way, which is why it would be so exciting to do, would be that maybe you could capture some of this shift in patterns much better than asking one more time at a second point, right? So if we could have diary data, then as we're collecting that throughout the months, one could pull in those changes in behavior much better, I think, than simply having a second survey at the end.
Are you going to continue to ask questions such as that we had about whether or not we have kids?
Whether what?
Whether or not we have children? Or younger people?
These are 18-year-olds. Are we talking about
the first population from your dissertation work?
Oh, am I going to continue to study them?
Yeah,
or?
Just say that was longitudinal.
Oh, it's only longitudinal in the sense that I went back this one time.
Go back again.
I don't know. I'll see. I mean, unfortunately, it's dropped down to 44, so that's already pretty low. I'm sort of deciding whether I want to or not. They were amazingly, the people I found were amazingly open to it and receptive and excited. So it could be something that I should probably do, even if it's a low number, just because no one has that kind of incredibly detailed data from already 5 years ago.
Well, could you ask the college kids then about the transfer effect of what they're doing, whether or not they are teaching their parents?
Yeah, that's something I definitely could. Yeah.
And something you tapped into earlier that is really fascinating that we don't know much about is the whole notion of proxy searching or using intermediaries, and that is when someone seeks information on behalf of someone else. That's just a very complicated area because you're talking about renegotiated information need, all this type of stuff. So it'd be good to find out to what degree when they're online that they are there on behalf of someone else.
Okay,
We're
right.
asked to do that, if we're doing it voluntarily.
Yeah, that's interesting. I sort of do another part of that, not that, which is also very interesting. I ask about whether they ever ask for support with their online activities. I do ask about that, but I don't ask how often they're asked for support, which is also
They do it
interesting.
voluntarily.
Right. Yeah,
Say,
that's
so
a really
you
good
should do
point.
this.
Yeah.
Especially if they're doing it for mom and dad.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have like to start writing down some of these ideas?
No. Well, we'll provide the DVD with the
Oh.
recording of all of this. It'll be trivial to do. All right. I tell you though, why don't we
Thank you. Did you have a question?
Yeah, you correlated between grades and usage of these areas. Did you try correlating things like general societal knowledge? Like, do the people that use the internet or local and national news have a better understanding of general news? Or
Oh, I don't have data like that here. It gets pretty tricky. I mean, as I'm sure you can imagine, how many correlates to collect data on it. I mean, this is actually a 20-page survey as is, which is gigantic. But that's an interesting idea too. One thing that I want to do, which is not so much current events knowledge, but it's a more basic cognitive skill test, which I had in a pre-test, but not in here. It's almost like a vocab test, and that I will include, which is sort of, it controls for offline just abilities at some level. So I'll include that, which might address that issue a little bit. But no, I mean, it's a great idea, but it's just there are limits after a point of what can be included.
yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for the great suggestions and questions. I really appreciate it.
Let's make the clapping sound again.
Yay.